I couldn't believe what I was seeing as I pulled up the gravel drive to my ranch. Three vehicles sat parked near my front porch like they owned the place. My father, Frank, stood there with a measuring tape stretching it across my pasture while talking animatedly to a woman in a business suit. My brother Danny leaned against his pickup truck arms, crossed wearing that smug expression I knew so well. The realtor held a clipboard thick with papers nodding enthusiastically as Frank gestured toward my barn. I sat frozen in my truck watching my own father plan to sell property that belonged to me. The same man who had cut me out of Christmas dinner 3 months ago was now treating my 40-acre investment like his personal piggy bank to rescue Danny's latest failed venture. The memory of that Christmas still burned like acid in my chest. Frank had called me on December 20th with news that shattered everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. Chelsea, Danny's girlfriend of 8 months, had complained that I made her uncomfortable during Thanksgiving dinner. My crime-asking pointed questions about her sudden interest in Danny after his pizza parlor business had received a $25,000 insurance settlement. "Max, you need to understand that Chelsea feels attacked when you're around," Frank had said over the phone, his voice carrying that familiar tone of disappointment. "Danny's finally found someone who believes in his potential, and your negative attitude is poisoning the relationship." I had sat in my apartment kitchen gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "Dad, she asked Danny to buy her a car before they'd been dating 2 months. She's obviously using him." "That's exactly the kind of judgment that makes family gatherings uncomfortable," Frank replied coldly. "I've decided it's better if you spend Christmas elsewhere this year. Give Danny and Chelsea some space to enjoy the holidays without walking on eggshells." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. 32 years old, and my father was choosing a gold digger over his own son. This wasn't the first time Frank had picked sides, but it was definitely the most brutal. Growing up, I had watched Frank bail Danny out of every mistake and failure. The failed pizza parlor that lost $18,000 because Danny spent more time partying than managing inventory. The car detailing business that collapsed when Danny got arrested for public intoxication and scared away all the customers. The fitness supplement pyramid scheme that cost Frank $12,000 in startup fees. Every disaster received the same response: Frank opening his wallet, while Danny promised this time would be different. Meanwhile, I had worked my way through college, earned my insurance adjuster certification, and built a solid career investigating property claims. I lived modestly, saved aggressively, and never asked Frank for anything. My independence seemed to annoy him more than Danny's constant failures. Christmas morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. I spent the day alone in my one-bedroom apartment watching other families post cheerful photos on social media. Danny's Instagram showed him surrounded by cousins and aunts at Frank's house, Chelsea prominently displayed in a red dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Frank had tagged the photo, "Blessed to have family who supports each other." That evening, scrolling through real estate listings became my therapy. I had been saving for years, accumulating nearly $60,000 through careful budgeting and smart investments. Properties outside Austin caught my attention, especially a 40-acre ranch listed for $55,000. The seller needed a quick cash deal due to relocation for work. I drove out the next morning, December 26th, to walk the property. The ranch house needed work, but the bones were solid. 40 acres of rolling pasture stretched toward a tree line that blocked any view of neighbors. The barn required new roofing, but the foundation was sound. Most importantly, it felt like peace after months of family drama. By New Year's Day, I owned the place outright. No mortgage, no monthly payments, just a clear deed with my name printed in official black letters. The freedom felt intoxicating after years of walking on eggshells around Frank's favoritism. I spent weekends throughout January and February fixing what I could afford to repair. New locks on all doors, fresh paint in the kitchen, basic plumbing repairs that saved hundreds in contractor fees. The work felt therapeutic, each improvement representing my independence from a family that valued manipulation over merit. The county assessor visited in early March to update property records for tax purposes. That routine visit revealed something that made my blood run cold. According to his files, someone had filed a mortgage lien against my property for $35,000, listing Frank as the loan guarantor and Danny as the primary beneficiary. I stared at the documents, reading the signatures that looked suspiciously similar to my own handwriting, but contained subtle differences I never would have made. Someone had forged my name on mortgage paperwork, using my property as collateral for a loan I never requested or received. The assessor, a middle-aged man named Robert, who had been doing this job for 15 years, shook his head sympathetically. Happens more than you'd think, especially with family disputes. Someone always thinks they can outsmart the system by filing fraudulent paperwork. Usually catches up with them eventually. That night, I couldn't sleep. Frank's desperation to fund Danny's lifestyle had apparently pushed him beyond simple favoritism into outright criminal activity. He genuinely believed I was too naive to check county records or understand property law. The betrayal cut deeper than Christmas dinner because it revealed just how little Frank respected my intelligence. My investigation into Frank's financial situation revealed a picture of escalating desperation that explained his willingness to commit fraud. Danny's restaurant, a sports bar called Danny's Den, owed nearly $50,000 to food suppliers and liquor distributors. Frank had mortgaged his own house to cover the initial startup costs, borrowing $43,000 against the property he and my mother had bought 30 years ago. The restaurant's Yelp reviews told a story of chronic mismanagement. Customers complained about wrong orders, long wait times, and Danny's visible intoxication during evening shifts. Health department inspection reports showed multiple violations for improper food storage and inadequate cleaning procedures. The business was hemorrhaging money with no realistic prospect of recovery. Frank's phone calls started coming twice a week, always following the same pattern. First, he would demand I return the family property that rightfully belonged to Danny's future. When I reminded him that I had purchased the ranch with my own money, he would launch into elaborate theories about family obligations and shared inheritance rights that made no legal sense. Your mother always wanted that land to stay in the family. He would say, conveniently forgetting that my mother had died 5 years before I bought the property, and it had never belonged to our family in the first place. Elena Rodriguez came highly recommended by Sarah Patterson, an insurance investigator I had worked with on several complex fraud cases. Elena specialized in property disputes and had earned a reputation for aggressive advocacy on behalf of clients facing title theft and deed fraud. Her office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian house near downtown Austin. Elena was younger than I expected, probably early 30s, with sharp brown eyes and the kind of confident handshake that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. Family property fraud is more common than people realize, Elena explained during our initial consultation. Adult children often discover their parents have been using their credit or property as collateral without permission. The emotional component makes these cases particularly ugly. She reviewed the forged mortgage documents with the methodical attention of someone who had seen every variation of financial deception. "This is sloppy work," she noted, pointing to inconsistencies in the signature dates and witness information. "Whoever filed this was counting on you never checking county records." Elena's strategy involved multiple layers of protection. First, filing formal complaints with both the county clerk's office and the state attorney general regarding the fraudulent mortgage. Second, installing comprehensive security measures at the ranch to document any trespassing or attempted theft. Third, building relationships with local law enforcement to ensure rapid response if Frank escalated his behavior. The security camera installation took an entire Saturday. I mounted 8 cameras around the property perimeter, focusing on the main gate, the house, and the barn, where someone could potentially hide vehicles. The system connected to my smartphone, sending alerts whenever motion triggered the sensors. Sheriff Tom Bradley, He walked into the roadside diner on a Thursday evening in late March, wearing civilian clothes, but carrying himself with unmistakable law enforcement bearing. I was sitting at the counter finishing a chicken fried steak dinner after spending the day repairing fence posts. "You're the insurance fellow who bought the old Henderson place," he said, settling onto the stool next to mine. "Tom Bradley." His handshake was firm without being aggressive. "Max Patterson, good to meet you." Tom ordered coffee and apple pie, then asked about my military background. The Army Reserve insignia on my truck had caught his attention. We talked for an hour about deployment experiences, his Marine service in Afghanistan, and the challenges of transitating military skills to civilian careers. "Elena Rodriguez mentioned you might be having some family difficulties regarding the property," he said eventually. "Not trying to pry, but if things escalate, don't hesitate to call. Property disputes can get heated quickly, especially when money's involved." I appreciated his directness. Tom wasn't offering to take sides, just ensuring I understood my options if Frank's harassment continued. The harassment did continue. Frank began showing up unannounced, always with Danny in tow for moral support. They would park at the gate and honk repeatedly until I came outside, then launch into increasingly desperate demands that I sign the property over to keep the family together. Danny's contributions to these conversations revealed the depth of his entitlement. He had already drawn up plans for converting the ranch into a wedding venue business, complete with a chapel in the barn and reception facilities in the pasture. Chelsea had been researching wedding photography packages and catering services, apparently convinced that I would eventually surrender my property to fund their entrepreneurial dreams. "You're being selfish, Max," Danny said during one particularly heated confrontation in early April. "This land could support a real business, not just some weekend hobby for a guy who doesn't understand agriculture." The irony was breathtaking. Danny, who had never successfully operated any business for more than 18 months, was lecturing me about land use while standing on property I had purchased with money I earned through my own competence. Frank's latest strategy involved enlisting extended family members to pressure me into doing the right thing. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years started calling with carefully worded suggestions that I considered Danny's financial needs. Aunts and uncles hinted that my mother would have wanted me to help my brother succeed. The manipulation campaign reached a new level when I discovered Frank had been telling everyone that I had somehow stolen the ranch from our family estate. According to his version of events, the property had been left to both Danny and me in our mother's will, but I had used legal technicalities to claim sole ownership. This was completely fabricated. My mother's estate had consisted of her car, some jewelry, and a small savings account that barely covered funeral expenses. She had never owned real estate or left any inheritance beyond sentimental items. But Frank's story provided a convenient narrative that painted me as greedy and Danny as a victim of legal manipulation. The social pressure was exhausting. Family gatherings became exercises in defensive justification, with me constantly explaining property law and purchase procedures to relatives who preferred Frank's dramatic story to boring reality. Several cousins stopped responding to my texts altogether, apparently convinced that I had somehow cheated Danny out of his inheritance. By the end of April, I realized Frank's campaign was building towards something larger than phone calls and family politics. The fraudulent mortgage papers suggested he believed he could actually claim legal ownership of my property. Elena's warnings about escalation began to feel prophetic rather than cautionary. The morning of May 15th started like any other Saturday until my phone buzzed with a security alert at 9:30. 3 vehicles had pulled through my gate without permission, parking in a neat line near my front porch like they were attending a business meeting. I watched the live camera feed from my kitchen table coffee, growing cold in my hand, as the situation unfolded. Frank emerged from his faded blue pickup truck wearing a suit and tie, looking more formal than I had seen him since my mother's funeral. Danny climbed out of his red sedan with Chelsea beside him, both dressed like they were heading to church or a court hearing. The third vehicle, a white SUV with real estate company logos on the doors, disgorged a professionally dressed woman carrying a briefcase and tablet computer. I grabbed my phone and called Elena immediately. "It's happening," I said, without preamble. "3 vehicles, including a realtor. They're on my property right now." "Stay inside and keep recording," Elena instructed. "I'm calling Sheriff Bradley and heading your way. Don't engage with them until we arrive." Through my security cameras, I watched Frank approach the front door with the confidence of someone who believed he owned the place. His knock was aggressive, the kind of pounding that demanded immediate attention. I could hear Danny's voice through the wood, urging me to stop hiding and face reality like a man. When I didn't answer, Frank pulled out a folder thick with documents and began showing them to the realtor. Even without audio, his gestures made it clear he was presenting himself as the legitimate property owner. The realtor, a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair, nodded along while taking notes on her tablet. Danny walked the perimeter of the house, peering through windows and testing door handles. His behavior suggested he was looking for signs of occupancy or vulnerability. Chelsea remained by the vehicles, apparently serving as a lookout while scrolling through her phone. The realtor began measuring the front porch, with a professional tape measure calling out dimensions to Frank, who wrote everything down in a notebook. They were treating my home like an asset to be evaluated and priced for immediate sale. Frank's phone conversation with someone was animated and excited. Through the security system's audio pickup, I caught fragments about buyer interest and quick closing and cash offers above asking price. He was discussing the sale of my property, as if the transaction was already approved and pending. The locksmith van arrived 20 minutes later, confirming my worst fears about Frank's intentions. The technician was a young man in coveralls who looked uncomfortable as Frank explained that I was mentally unstable and needed to be prevented from accessing the property for my own safety. Frank presented what appeared to be legal documents, pointing to official-looking seals and signatures, while explaining that he held power of attorney over my affairs. The locksmith examined the paperwork carefully, clearly uncertain about the situation's legitimacy. "Sir, I'll need to see identification and verify these documents before I can change locks on occupied property," the locksmith said professionally. "This kind of situation requires additional verification." Frank's response was immediate and explosive. "Are you questioning my authority over my own son's welfare? These documents were prepared by attorneys and notarized properly. I'm trying to prevent him from making dangerous decisions that could result in injury or financial ruin." The emotional manipulation was masterful, painting Frank as a concerned parent dealing with an unstable adult child. The locksmith's hesitation suggested the performance was working. Danny joined the conversation, adding his own theatrical concerns about my mental state. "He's been acting erratically since our mother died," Danny explained with convincing sincerity. "Making impulsive purchases, isolating himself from family, refusing medical treatment for obvious psychological problems. This was completely fabricated, but Danny delivered the lies with such conviction that even I began to doubt my own perceptions." The locksmith looked increasingly convinced that he was witnessing a legitimate family intervention. The realtor, introduced as Sandra Walsh, began photographing the property from multiple angles, while Frank and Danny distracted the locksmith with their mental health concerns. Sandra's efficiency suggested she had done this before documenting assets for rapid sale, while families dealt with legal complications. Sandra's phone calls were conducted far enough from the house that my security audio couldn't capture specific words, but her body language indicated active negotiations with potential buyers. She was treating this like a standard listing, apparently convinced that Frank's documentation legitimized the sale process. Frank's emotional escalation reached a peak when he noticed my truck parked behind the barn. "He's here somewhere, hiding like always instead of facing his responsibilities," Frank shouted loud enough for the neighbors to hear. This is exactly the kind of behavior that proves he can't handle property ownership. Danny began circling the house more aggressively, calling my name and demanding that I come outside for a family meeting about my future. His tone was condescending, like he was addressing a child who had misbehaved and needed correction. The locksmith started working on my front door lock, apparently satisfied by Frank's documentation and emotional appeals. Watching a stranger dismantle my home security while my father supervised felt like a violation that cut deeper than simple theft. Sandra Walsh completed her property assessment and began printing contracts on a portable printer from her vehicle. The speed of her preparation suggested this was a coordinated effort designed to complete a sale before I could mount legal resistance. Frank's phone conversation with what sounded like potential buyers became increasingly excited. He was quoting asking prices and discussing closing timelines like the property transfer was already legally approved. His confidence was chilling because it suggested he genuinely believed his fraudulent documents would withstand legal scrutiny. The situation reached a breaking point when Danny found a basement window that wasn't properly secured and began trying to force it open. He was attempting to gain unauthorized entry to my home while Frank distracted the locksmith with continued explanations about my alleged mental incompetence. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. 5 minutes out, Sheriff Bradley is with me. Keep recording everything. The cavalry was coming, but watching my family orchestrate the theft of my property in real time felt like a nightmare that wouldn't end. Frank had crossed every line of basic human decency, but his performance was so convincing that even trained professionals were being manipulated into participating in his scheme. Sandra Walsh printed what appeared to be a purchase agreement and began explaining terms to Frank while pointing at various clauses. They were conducting a real estate transaction for property they didn't own, with buyers who apparently had no idea they were participating in fraud. The most shocking revelation came when I overheard Sandra discussing Danny's wedding venue business plan with Frank. This wasn't just about stealing my property. It was about converting it into a commercial enterprise that would fund Danny and Chelsea's lifestyle indefinitely. Frank had apparently convinced Sandra that I was an incompetent young man who had made an impulsive purchase beyond my financial means, and that transferring ownership to Danny represented a responsible family intervention. The story was believable enough that a licensed real estate professional was actively facilitating what she believed was a legitimate transaction. As Elena's vehicle pulled through my gate with Sheriff Bradley's patrol car close behind, I realized this confrontation would determine whether justice existed for families destroyed by greed and manipulation, or whether Frank's lies would prove more powerful than truth. Elena's white sedan arrived first, followed immediately by Sheriff Bradley's patrol car and a second vehicle carrying Deputy Martinez. The cavalry had arrived just as the locksmith finished installing new hardware on my front door, completely unaware that he was helping facilitate theft. I watched through the security cameras as Elena stepped out of her car with the bearing of someone accustomed to battlefield situations. She wore a navy blue business suit and carried a briefcase that looked expensive enough to signal serious legal representation. Sheriff Bradley emerged from his patrol car in full uniform, his hand resting casually on his radio as he surveyed the scene. Frank's reaction was immediate and telling. His confident posture crumbled the moment he saw law enforcement, and he began shuffling through his paperwork with the desperation of someone whose lies were about to be exposed. Danny froze beside the house, still holding the basement window he had been trying to force open. "Good morning, folks," Sheriff Bradley announced in a voice that carried across the entire property. "We've received reports of possible trespassing and fraudulent activity on this property. I'm going to need everyone to step away from the building and present identification." Sandra Walsh looked confused and slightly panicked, clearly unprepared for law enforcement involvement in what she had believed was a routine family property transfer. The locksmith immediately began gathering his tools, recognizing that he had stumbled into a legal situation beyond his expertise. Elena approached Frank directly, her movements deliberate and professional. Mr. Patterson, I'm Elena Rodriguez, representing the legal property owner Max Patterson. I believe you have documents claiming ownership or authority over this property that you'd like to present for examination. Frank's response was to clutch his folder of papers protectively while launching into his prepared speech about my mental incompetence and his parental authority. My son is clearly unable to handle property ownership responsibly, he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. These documents establish my legal right to prevent him from making dangerous financial decisions. Elena extended her hand calmly. I'd be happy to review those documents. As you surely know, power of attorney requires specific legal procedures and court approval in cases involving adult children and property transfers. The locksmith stepped forward, apologetically, holding the old lock mechanism he had removed from my door. Ma'am, I was hired to change locks based on these documents, he explained to Elena while gesturing toward Frank's folder. If there's any question about their legitimacy, I can reinstall the original hardware immediately. Sheriff Bradley moved closer to examine Frank's paperwork, his expression growing increasingly skeptical as he read the documents. Sir, these appear to be private agreements rather than court-ordered authority. Do you have judicial approval for power of attorney over an adult child's property? Frank's answer revealed the depth of his delusion about legal procedures. Family property doesn't require court approval, he insisted with conviction. I'm his father, and I'm protecting him from his own poor judgment. The law recognizes parental authority in cases of mental instability. Deputy Martinez had been quietly observing Sandra Walsh's behavior, noting her increasing nervousness as the legal implications became clear. Ma'am, are you aware that this property is under dispute? He asked professionally. Real estate transactions involving contested ownership can result in serious legal consequences for all parties involved. Sandra's response was immediate and defensive. I was presented with what appeared to be legitimate ownership documents, she said quickly. Mr. Patterson showed me power of attorney paperwork and explained that his son had made an impulsive purchase that the family needed to reverse. Elena opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder of her own documents. Sheriff Bradley, I have here the original property deed showing Max Patterson as the sole legal owner, county records showing the property tax payments made by Max Patterson, and documentation of fraudulent mortgage liens filed against this property using forged signatures. The transformation in Sheriff Bradley's demeanor was immediate and serious. Fraudulent mortgage liens constitute a felony under Texas property law, he announced loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm going to need to examine all documents related to this property immediately. Frank's panic became visible as Elena spread her documentation across the hood of her sedan for official examination. The county records clearly showed my legal ownership, while Frank's documents revealed obvious forgeries and procedural violations that any trained professional could identify. Danny attempted to flee the scene by walking quickly toward his vehicle, but Deputy Martinez intercepted him with calm authority. Sir, I'm going to need you to remain present while we sort out this situation. Leaving now could be interpreted as consciousness of guilt regarding the attempted property theft. The moment that changed everything came when Sandra Walsh's phone rang during the document examination. She answered without thinking, and her conversation was loud enough for everyone to hear. Danny, the deal is falling apart, she said into the phone. There are lawyers and police here, and your father's documents don't look legitimate. Sheriff Bradley's head snapped up immediately. Ma'am, did you just call someone named Danny, and you're discussing this property transaction with him? Sandra realized her mistake instantly, but the damage was done. Elena stepped forward with renewed intensity. Sheriff Bradley, I believe we just witnessed evidence that this real estate agent has been coordinating with Danny Patterson, the alleged beneficiary of this property theft, rather than acting as a neutral professional. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Sandra Walsh's phone contained dozens of text messages coordinating the property theft with Danny, including discussions about splitting the profits from the sale and plans for converting the ranch into a wedding venue business. Frank's complete emotional breakdown occurred when confronted with the text message evidence. He began shouting about family loyalty and my obligations to support Danny's dreams, completely abandoning any pretense of legal authority or parental concern. He owes this to his brother. Frank screamed loud enough for neighbors to hear. Danny deserves a chance to succeed, and Max is being selfish by keeping property that could save the family business. Elena's response was calm and devastating. Mr. Patterson, you've just admitted on record that this attempted theft was motivated by financial gain rather than concern for your son's welfare. Sheriff Bradley, I believe we have sufficient evidence for multiple felony charges. The locksmith provided the final piece of evidence by revealing that Frank had paid him in cash and specifically requested that no paperwork be generated for the lock change service. This suggested premeditation and awareness that the activity was illegal. Sheriff Bradley's arrest announcements were professional and thorough. Frank and Danny were charged with attempted theft, fraud, conspiracy, and trespassing. Sandra Walsh faced charges related to real estate fraud and conspiracy, plus the potential loss of her professional license. Deputy Martinez read them their rights, while Elena documented everything with her phone camera. The contrast between Frank's earlier confidence and his current defeat was striking, revealing how completely his elaborate scheme had collapsed under professional scrutiny. The most satisfying moment came when Elena presented Frank with a restraining order preventing any future contact with me or my property. Mr. Patterson, any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and additional charges, she explained with the same professional calm she had maintained throughout the confrontation. As the patrol cars departed with Frank, Danny, and Sandra Walsh in custody, I finally emerged from my house to survey the damage and begin the process of reclaiming my peace of mind. The locksmith apologized profusely while reinstalling my original locks, refusing payment for his work, and offering to provide testimony about Frank's deceptive hiring practices. His cooperation demonstrated that honest people could distinguish between legitimate authority and criminal manipulation when presented with clear evidence. Elena's final observation as we watched the police vehicles disappear was both sobering and hopeful. Family betrayal is always the most painful form of theft, but it also reveals who deserves your trust and who doesn't. Some lessons are expensive but necessary. The ranch felt different that afternoon, like a weight had been lifted that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. For the first time since buying the property, I could enjoy it without looking over my shoulder for the next crisis Frank might manufacture. The formal charges were filed on Monday morning at the Travis County Courthouse, with Elena presenting a comprehensive case that impressed even the seasoned prosecutors handling property fraud cases. Frank Patterson, Danny Patterson, and Sandra Walsh each faced multiple felonies that could result in significant prison time and financial restitution. Frank's charges were the most serious attempted theft of property, over $30,000 fraud, involving forged documents, conspiracy to commit theft, and filing false instruments with county officials. The prosecutor explained that Texas law treated property theft involving family members as seriously as theft from strangers, particularly when sophisticated planning was involved. Danny's charges included conspiracy to commit theft, trespassing, and attempted breaking and entering. His text message communications with Sandra Walsh provided clear evidence of premeditation and coordination, eliminating any possibility that he had been an unwitting participant in Frank's scheme. Sandra Walsh faced the most professionally devastating consequences. Beyond criminal charges for real estate fraud and conspiracy, the Texas Real Estate Commission initiated proceedings to revoke her license permanently. Her involvement in forged document schemes could prevent her from working in any licensed profession for years. The arraignment hearing revealed the full scope of their delusion about legal consequences. Frank appeared without an attorney, apparently believing he could represent himself and convinced the judge that family disputes shouldn't involve criminal prosecution. His courtroom performance was a masterclass in self-incrimination. Your Honor, this is simply a misunderstanding between family members about property that should have belonged to both my sons, Frank declared during his opportunity to address the court. Max has always been irresponsible with money, and I was trying to protect our family's interests. Judge Martinez listened patiently before responding with the kind of clarity that cuts through delusion. Mr. Patterson, the court records clearly show that your son, Max, purchased this property legally with his own funds. Attempting to steal legally owned property is a felony regardless of family relationships or personal opinions about financial responsibility. Danny's attorney, a public defender who had obviously advised him to remain silent, looked increasingly frustrated as Danny insisted on explaining his wedding venue business plan to the court. The judge's expression suggested that discussing future commercial use of stolen property was not helping Danny's case. Sandra Walsh's private attorney managed to negotiate a plea agreement that avoided prison time in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation and immediate license surrender. Her testimony revealed that Danny had approached her months earlier with a plan to claim family property through fraudulent documentation promising her a substantial commission from the eventual sale. The investigation expanded when Sheriff Bradley's department discovered that Frank and Danny had attempted similar schemes against two elderly neighbors whose property adjoined potential commercial development areas. Both families had rebuffed their approaches, but the pattern suggested a systematic approach to property theft rather than an isolated family dispute. Elena's preparation for the criminal proceedings was thorough and methodical. She had compiled security camera footage, recorded phone conversations, documented financial records, and witness statements that painted a complete picture of deliberate criminal conspiracy. Her presentation was so comprehensive that Frank's court-appointed attorney advised him to negotiate a plea agreement rather than risk trial. The restitution hearing addressed not only the attempted theft, but also the costs I had incurred defending my legal ownership. Frank was ordered to pay my legal fees, security system costs, property title insurance, and punitive damages totaling nearly $15,000. The judge noted that attempting to steal property through fraud imposed significant defensive costs on victims that deserved compensation. Danny's plea agreement included a requirement to attend financial responsibility counseling and perform 200 hours of community service focused on property maintenance for elderly residents. The judge noted that someone who had never successfully managed a business had no standing to claim someone else's property for entrepreneurial ventures. Frank's sentence was more severe due to his role as the primary organizer and his complete lack of remorse during legal proceedings. 6 months in county jail, 3 years probation, and full restitution represented serious consequences for a man who had never faced criminal charges before. The most satisfying aspect of the legal proceedings was watching Frank's elaborate justifications crumble under objective scrutiny. His claims about family property rights and parental authority were revealed as self-serving delusions with no basis in law or reality. The extended family's reaction to the criminal charges was mixed and revealing. Several relatives who had pressured me to work things out with Frank suddenly distanced themselves from the situation, claiming they had been misled about the circumstances. Others quietly reached out with apologies, acknowledging that Frank's version of events had never quite made sense. My cousin Patricia called the evening after Frank's sentencing to offer an apology that felt genuine. "I should have known something was wrong when Frank kept changing his story about how you got the property," she admitted. "He made it sound like you had used some legal loophole to cheat Danny, but property purchases don't work that way." Uncle Robert, Frank's brother, visited the ranch to see the property firsthand and understand what the conflict had really been about. His reaction was a mixture of embarrassment and anger at Frank's behavior. Your father made this sound like you had stolen some ancestral farm that had been in the family for generations, he said while walking the pasture. This is just regular land that you bought with your own money. I don't understand why he thought Danny deserved it. The most unexpected apology came from Chelsea, Danny's girlfriend, who called to explain that she had ended their relationship immediately after learning about the criminal charges. I thought Danny's family had money and property, she admitted with refreshing honesty. Finding out that he was trying to steal from his own brother to impress me was disgusting. I'm not that kind of person. Danny's letter from jail arrived 3 weeks after his sentencing, written in the careful handwriting of someone who had time to think about his choices. The letter was 2 pages long and represented the first honest communication I had received from my brother in years. Max, I know an apology doesn't fix what I did, but I need you to know that I'm ashamed of myself, he wrote. I've always been jealous of how easily things came to you, and I convinced myself that you didn't deserve success because you didn't have to struggle like I did. That's not true, and it's not fair. It's not. The letter continued with admissions about his financial irresponsibility and entitlement that suggested genuine self-reflection. Dad always told me that family money should be shared, but you earned your money through your own work. I had no right to any of it. And trying to steal your property was wrong, no matter how Dad justified it. Elena's final legal action involved filing a comprehensive lien against Frank's property to secure the restitution payments. Property fraud often involves people who don't have liquid assets to pay judgments, she explained. Securing restitution through property liens ensures that victims actually receive compensation rather than just symbolic court orders. The criminal justice process had taken 4 months from arrest to final sentencing, but the resolution felt complete and fair. Frank's scheme had failed completely. Danny faced genuine consequences for his choices, and I retained clear ownership of property I had purchased legally. Sheriff Bradley's final observation during his last visit to check on my security situation was both reassuring and sobering. Family property disputes bring out the worst in people, but they also reveal character in ways that can't be hidden. Your family showed you who they really are, and you handled it with more dignity than most people would manage. The ranch felt truly peaceful for the first time since I had bought it. The legal cloud had been lifted, the family pressure had ended, and the future stretched ahead without the constant threat of manufactured crises. The decision to press full charges despite family pressure to handle everything privately represented a turning point in my understanding of relationships and personal boundaries. Aunt Marie had called repeatedly pleading for me to think about family unity and drop the criminal charges against Frank and Danny. Her arguments followed familiar patterns about forgiveness and second chances that ignored the severity of attempted property theft. Max, your father, made a mistake, but destroying the family over money seems extreme, she had argued during one particularly persistent phone call. Can't you find it in your heart to work this out without involving the legal system? My response had evolved through weeks of reflection and counseling with Elena, who had experience helping clients navigate family betrayal. Aunt Marie, Frank didn't make a mistake. He planned and executed a deliberate scheme to steal my property using forged documents. That's not a family disagreement. It's a serious crime that deserves serious consequences. The pressure to minimize Frank's criminal behavior revealed how deeply family dysfunction had been normalized over decades. Multiple relatives expected me to absorb financial and emotional damage to preserve an illusion of family harmony that had never actually existed. Frank's court-ordered restitution payments began arriving monthly each check, a tangible reminder that actions have consequences regardless of family relationships. The payments covered my legal fees, security system costs, and additional expenses I had incurred defending my property rights. More importantly, they represented Frank's forced acknowledgement that my ownership was legitimate and his behavior had been criminal. The emotional work of processing family betrayal required professional help that I had initially resisted. Dr. Sarah Kim, a therapist specializing in family trauma and boundary setting, provided tools for understanding the psychological dynamics that had enabled Frank's behavior and my own responses to it. Family scapegoating often involves one member being blamed for problems they didn't create, while others avoid accountability, Dr. Kim explained during our third session. Your father's favoritism toward Danny created a dynamic where Danny never learned consequences, and you were expected to absorb the emotional and financial costs of his failures. The therapy sessions helped me recognize patterns that extended far beyond the property theft. Frank's Christmas exclusion hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a lifelong pattern where my boundaries and needs were sacrificed to enable Danny's irresponsibility. Danny's letter from jail had surprised me with its apparent sincerity, but Dr. Kim cautioned against rushing toward reconciliation without evidence of genuine change. Apologies from people facing criminal consequences often reflect situational remorse rather than character transformation, she noted. Genuine change requires consistent behavior over time, not just words written during a crisis. The ranch renovation work became therapeutic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Each improvement represented my investment in a future that Frank couldn't threaten or Danny couldn't claim. Installing new fencing around the pasture perimeter felt like establishing boundaries that no one could cross without permission. Sheriff Bradley visited regularly during the renovation, officially checking on security, but clearly interested in the property's transformation. His military background created natural rapport as we discussed practical improvements and future plans. "You've got something special here," Tom observed while helping me install a new gate for the main pasture. Property ownership represents freedom in a way that people who've never earned it can't understand. Your father and brother saw dollar signs, but you're building something permanent. The conversation revealed that Tom had faced similar family pressure when he purchased his own small ranch after military service. "My brother thought I was being selfish for not investing in his construction business instead," he shared. "Some people believe family money should always go toward their dreams rather than your independence." The first Christmas at my ranch approached with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. I had extended invitations to family members who had supported me during the legal proceedings, while maintaining boundaries with those who had pressured me to minimize Frank's crimes. Cousin Patricia and her husband arrived early to help with preparations, bringing homemade bread and genuine enthusiasm for seeing the property I had worked so hard to protect. Uncle Robert came with his wife and 2 teenage children, creating the kind of family gathering that felt supportive rather than obligatory. The Christmas dinner conversation avoided the legal proceedings, entirely focusing instead on the positive changes each person was making in their own lives. Patricia's daughter had started college with a scholarship for academic achievement. Uncle Robert's son had earned Eagle Scout recognition through a community service project. The achievements represented personal responsibility and hard work, rather than entitlement and manipulation. Dr. Kim had prepared me for the emotional complexity of hosting family while maintaining boundaries with Frank and Danny. Rebuilding relationships after betrayal requires selecting people based on their character rather than their genetics, she had explained. Some family members deserve your trust, and others have disqualified themselves through their choices. The evening's most meaningful moment came when Uncle Robert raised his glass for a toast that acknowledged the year's challenges without dwelling on them. To Max, for showing us that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it in the end. Frank's absence from Christmas felt natural rather than forced, a relief that surprised me with its completeness. For the first time in years, holiday conversation didn't require defensive explanations or emotional navigation around his favoritism and manipulation. Danny's second letter arrived in late January, written after completing his community service and beginning the financial counseling required by his plea agreement. The letter was shorter, but seemed more genuine than his initial apology, focusing on specific changes he was making, rather than general expressions of remorse. "I'm working at a warehouse and living in a small apartment," he wrote. It's the first time I've supported myself without Dad's money, and it's harder than I expected, but also more satisfying. I'm learning that earning something feels different than being given it. The letter included no request for reconciliation or forgiveness, just information about his progress, and acknowledgement that rebuilding trust would require consistent behavior over years rather than months. His tone suggested that facing consequences had forced genuine self-reflection that decades of enablement had prevented. Elena's final legal action involved establishing a comprehensive property protection trust that would prevent any future attempts at fraudulent claims against my ownership. The documentation was so thorough that any legitimate buyer or lender would immediately identify attempted fraud. Property theft often involves repeat offenders who target multiple victims using similar schemes, Elena explained while reviewing the trust documents. This level of protection ensures that your property rights are bulletproof against any future manipulation. The spring renovation projects included building a workshop in the barn and installing solar panels that would make the property partially energy independent. Each improvement represented my commitment to long-term ownership and stewardship rather than short-term profit. The most significant personal development was meeting Sarah Mitchell at a community planning meeting about rural road maintenance. Sarah worked as a veterinarian for large animal practices and lived on a smaller ranch about 10 miles from my property. Our conversation about livestock care led to coffee dates that felt natural and unforced. Sarah's approach to relationships was refreshing after years of family manipulation and drama. She was direct about her expectations, respectful of boundaries, and genuinely interested in building something mutual rather than extracting resources or emotional labor. I've seen too many relationships destroyed by financial disputes and family drama, she shared during our fourth dinner together. My rule is simple: I take care of my responsibilities, and I expect the same from anyone I date seriously. Her independence and self-sufficiency created space for genuine partnership rather than the codependent dynamics that had characterized my family relationships. She appreciated the ranch as a reflection of my values rather than viewing it as a source of financial opportunity. By summer, the legal proceedings had concluded completely. Frank had served his sentence and begun probation, and Danny was consistently making restitution payments from his warehouse job. The crisis had passed, leaving lessons about family boundaries and personal strength that would influence every future relationship. The ranch represented more than property ownership. It symbolized the possibility of building something valuable through honest work and protecting it through appropriate boundaries. The year's events had been painful, but ultimately clarifying about what kind of life and relationships I wanted to cultivate. The August morning when Frank called to ask if he could visit the ranch marked exactly 1 year since his arrest and represented a conversation I had been both dreading and anticipating. His voice carried a hesitancy I had never heard before, stripped of the aggressive entitlement that had characterized our previous communications. "Max, I know I don't deserve your time, but I'd like to see what you've built and maybe have an honest conversation," he said simply. "I've been working with a counselor through the probation program, and I need to make some real amends rather than just paying court-ordered restitution." The request surprised me because it contained no demands or manipulation, just a straightforward acknowledgement of his past behavior and a request for permission to visit my property. Dr. Kim and I had discussed this possibility during our sessions, preparing for the moment when Frank might seek genuine reconciliation rather than strategic advantage. I agreed to a short visit with clear boundaries, 1 hour Elena present as a witness, and no discussion of future financial arrangements or property transfers. Frank accepted these conditions without argument, suggesting that his year of consequences had indeed created some self-reflection. Frank's appearance when he arrived reflected his changed circumstances. He drove an older sedan instead of his pickup truck, dressed in work clothes, rather than his previous business casual attire. His demeanor was subdued but respectful as Elena and I met him at the front gate. "The place looks incredible," he said quietly while surveying the renovated barn, new fencing, and solar panel installation. "I can see how much work you've put into it." We walked the property perimeter, while Frank shared updates about his life since the legal proceedings concluded. He had sold his house to pay legal fees and restitution, moving into a small apartment near his warehouse job. Danny was living independently for the first time, working steadily and attending community college courses in business management. I spent 40 years believing that being a father meant protecting Danny from consequences, Frank admitted while we examined the pasture fence I had rebuilt. I thought love meant making things easy for him, but I was actually preventing him from becoming a competent adult. The conversation revealed genuine insight that surprised me with its depth. Frank's counseling had apparently addressed the favoritism and enabling patterns that had damaged both his sons in different ways. Danny had been disabled by excessive help, while I had been burdened with unrealistic expectations for maturity and self-sufficiency. You succeeded despite my parenting, not because of it, Frank continued with painful honesty. I criticized your independence because it reminded me that Danny wasn't developing the same strength, but instead of helping him grow, I just resented you for being capable. Elena listened quietly while taking notes, her presence serving as both witness and protection against potential manipulation. But Frank's behavior seemed genuinely different, focused on accountability rather than excuse-making or emotional manipulation. The most significant moment came when Frank asked about my plans for the property, without suggesting any role for himself or Danny in those plans. His questions were respectful curiosity about my goals rather than attempts to insert himself into my decision-making process. I'm planning to expand the solar installation and maybe add some livestock, I shared cautiously. Sarah and I have been discussing the possibility of boarding horses for people who don't have enough land for their own animals. Frank's response was simply, "That sounds like a solid business plan. You've always been good at thinking through practical details." The acknowledgement was small but significant, because it represented the first time Frank had recognized my competence, without comparing it to Danny's struggles or suggesting I should use my abilities to solve someone else's problems. As our hour concluded, Frank made a request that demonstrated his understanding of appropriate boundaries. Would it be possible for me to visit again in 6 months, assuming my behavior continues to improve? I'd like to rebuild some kind of relationship with you, but I understand it needs to be on your terms. I agreed to consider future visits based on his continued progress in counseling and consistent respectful behavior. The conversation ended with a handshake rather than a hug, acknowledging that trust would be rebuilt gradually through actions rather than restored instantly through words. Danny's transformation was even more surprising when he visited in September, arriving alone and asking permission before stepping onto my property. His year of independent living had changed his demeanor dramatically, replacing entitlement with genuine humility. "I wanted to see what I was trying to steal," he said directly, while examining the workshop I had built in the barn. "I had no idea how much work and planning goes into maintaining a property like this." Danny's community service work with elderly residents had exposed him to people who had spent decades building equity through consistent effort. "Mrs. Rodriguez has been maintaining her house for 30 years, he shared, while helping me repair a section of fence. "She showed me all the improvements she's made over time, and I realized I'd never actually built anything permanent in my life." His warehouse job had provided the first steady income he had ever earned without Frank's financial support. "It's not glamorous work, but knowing that I earned every dollar makes it feel different," he explained. "I used to think work was something you did until you found an easier way to make money, but maybe work is actually how you build character." The conversation revealed that Danny's wedding venue dreams had been fundamentally unrealistic because he had never researched the licensing, insurance, and operational requirements for commercial event hosting. "I thought you could just charge people to use your land for parties," he admitted with embarrassment. "I didn't know about health department permits or liability insurance or any of the legal requirements." Danny's apology was more specific and actionable than his letters had been. "I stole a year of peace from you by making you defend something you owned legally," he said while helping me stack firewood for winter. I can't give that time back, but I can make sure it never happens again. His request for future contact was appropriately modest occasional text messages about his progress in school and work, with the possibility of gradual rebuilding of brotherly relationship based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. The documentary filmmaker who contacted me in October represented an unexpected opportunity to transform my painful experience into advocacy for other victims of family property fraud. Rachel Torres produced investigative documentaries about financial abuse within families, and my case illustrated patterns she had documented across dozens of similar situations. Elder abuse gets attention, but adult children stealing from their siblings or parents rarely receives media coverage, Rachel explained during our initial phone conversation. Your case demonstrates how family property fraud actually works and why the criminal justice system needs to treat these crimes seriously. The documentary project required careful consideration because it would make my private family crisis into public education material. But Elena and Dr. Kim both supported the idea as a way to help other victims recognize manipulation tactics and understand their legal options. Filming took place over 3 days in November, with interviews conducted at the ranch to show the property I had worked to protect. The documentary would include security camera footage from the attempted theft legal documents, showing the fraudulent mortgage and interviews with Elena and Sheriff Bradley about the criminal investigation. Rachel's research revealed that family property fraud was significantly underreported because victims often faced pressure to handle disputes privately to avoid family conflict. Many cases never reached law enforcement because relatives convinced victims that criminal prosecution would be excessive or harmful to family unity. Your decision to press charges sent a clear message that property theft is a crime, regardless of family relationships, Rachel noted while filming my interview. That example could help other victims understand that protecting themselves legally isn't selfish or vindictive. The documentary would air on a regional public television network and stream online, potentially reaching thousands of people dealing with similar family manipulation. My story would illustrate that family predators often escalate their behavior when initial manipulation fails, making early legal intervention crucial for preventing more serious crimes. Christmas at the ranch in my second year of ownership felt like a celebration of genuine family rather than an obligation to enable dysfunction. Sarah joined the gathering, fitting naturally into conversations with relatives who had supported me through the legal crisis. Uncle Robert brought updates about Frank's continued progress in counseling and Danny's academic success in community college business courses. Frank is working steadily and hasn't asked anyone for money in 8 months, he reported. Danny made the dean's list last semester and seems genuinely committed to learning how to manage finances responsibly. The positive changes were encouraging, but Dr. Kim had prepared me for the long-term nature of genuine behavioral change. People can modify their actions quickly when facing consequences, but changing underlying attitudes and patterns often takes years, she had explained. Sustainable relationships require evidence of consistent change over time, not just temporary improvements during crisis. Sarah's presence at family gatherings provided perspective from someone outside our historical dysfunction. Your relatives seem genuinely proud of what you've accomplished here, she observed while helping clean up after Christmas dinner. There's no undercurrent of resentment or competition like I've seen in some families. Her comment highlighted how different healthy family dynamics felt compared to the manipulation and favoritism I had accepted as normal for decades. People who genuinely cared about my success didn't try to claim credit for my achievements or demand access to the benefits of my work. The ranch's second year brought new projects that reflected long-term planning rather than crisis management. The horseboarding business Sarah and I developed attracted clients from nearby suburbs who wanted their animals to have more space than urban facilities could provide. Each boarding client represented income that supported property maintenance while building equity in land that belonged to me completely. The business success felt different from my insurance career because it involved assets I owned rather than services I performed for others. The most satisfying aspect of the property's development was watching Frank and Danny's growing respect for what I had built through my own planning and effort. Neither had ever sustained a project requiring multiple years of consistent investment, and their new humility reflected recognition that building something valuable required qualities they had never developed. Frank's final restitution payment arrived in March, officially concluding the criminal justice process that had begun with his arrest nearly 2 years earlier. The check included a handwritten note thanking me for holding him accountable instead of enabling his behavior like previous family members had done. I spent years teaching Danny that consequences were optional and problems could always be solved with manipulation or family pressure, Frank wrote. You showed both of us that reality doesn't work that way, and that lesson was worth more than the legal fees it cost me to learn it. The note represented genuine acknowledgement that appropriate boundaries had ultimately benefited everyone involved, even those who initially resented them. Frank's year of working hourly jobs and living within his means had apparently provided insights about personal responsibility that decades of enabling others had prevented. As spring arrived at the ranch, I reflected on the lessons that 2 years of family crisis had taught about relationships, boundaries, and personal strength. The most important insight was that protecting yourself from family manipulation isn't selfish. It's necessary for maintaining the kind of relationships worth having. People who genuinely love you don't demand access to your resources or expect you to absorb the consequences of their poor decisions. Real family members celebrate your success rather than resenting it, respect your boundaries rather than testing them, and support your independence rather than trying to undermine it. Sarah and I had begun discussing marriage and the possibility of expanding the ranch operation to include a veterinary clinic serving rural properties. Our conversations about the future felt collaborative, rather than extractive based on mutual contribution, rather than one person funding another's dreams. The most profound change was my understanding that family relationships, like all relationships, should be voluntary associations between people who enhance each other's lives, rather than obligatory connections that drain energy and resources. Frank and Danny had earned the opportunity for limited contact through consistent behavioral change. But they would never again have automatic access to my time, property, or emotional labor. The documentary about family property fraud premiered in May, featuring my story, alongside interviews with legal experts and other victims who had faced similar manipulation. The response was overwhelming, with dozens of viewers contacting Rachel to share their own experiences and request resources for protecting themselves legally. My final thought about the entire experience was that sometimes the greatest gift family can give you is showing you clearly who they really are, even when that revelation is painful. Frank's attempted theft had hurt deeply, but it had also forced me to develop strength and discernment that would protect me from future manipulation by anyone. The ranch represented more than property ownership. It symbolized the possibility of building a life based on your own values rather than other people's expectations. Every improvement I made, every boundary I maintained, and every relationship I chose contributed to creating the kind of existence that reflected my character rather than my family's dysfunction. Standing on my front porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the pasture in gold and orange light, I understood that the question isn't whether family will disappoint you, but whether you'll have the courage to protect what you've built when they do. Have you ever had to choose between family peace and personal boundaries? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you handled situations where people you loved tried to take advantage of your success or generosity. Your story might help someone else recognize manipulation before it escalates to the level I experienced. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video to help others find it when they're facing similar family conflicts. Subscribe to my channel for more stories about overcoming family dysfunction and building healthy boundaries. And please share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding that protecting yourself isn't selfish, even when family members claim it is. Thank you for listening to my story and supporting my journey toward building relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. I hope your own family experiences are filled with the kind of love that celebrates your success rather than resenting it. And I wish you the strength to protect what you've built from anyone who would try to take it from you.